Just to begin with, I just want to quickly share with you how the speaking exam is scored. For each of your 4 questions, you will be assigned a grade of 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. If you get 1 for each one, well, that will give you an average of 1, which would give you a score of 8 in this exam. Average of 2 will give you 15. I presume most of you think that's too low. So you're probably looking for an average maybe about 3 for each of these questions, which would give you 23. And of course, if you get everything, a high score for all of them, then you're going to be looking at 30 altogether for this. Okay, so before we focus on the questions there, I just want to talk a little bit about how to improve your speaking to prepare for the exam. The first one is about learning to speak naturally. One of the things the examiners will be looking at is your fluency. One of the most important things you really need to do is learn to think in English, so that when you speak English, you actually think English rather than translate. One of the problems when you translate is you have to think about what you want to say. And if you do that, then it becomes really difficult to actually speak with any degree of fluency. If you have a problem like that, that probably means that you're going to be around about scoring 2 for each question. So in order to get up to the marks probably you're looking for, you need to be able to speak with a degree of fluency. And that means that for the most part, you need to be able to speak without translating. Now, you're probably thinking, but that's difficult. That's hard. How can I do that? Well, the simple question, the answer to that is partly to do with practice, but also because the fact that language is patterns, basically. So you learn the patterns, you practice the patterns, and they get to the point where they become automatic, like riding a bicycle or driving a car. We're actually later on, we're going to be looking at a reading passage and lecture dealing with this idea of automaticity in language. It's a really, really important point. Basically, learn some basic sentences, get used to using them, and then it just becomes automatically. I do actually have some experience of this. When I was at school, like you, I had to learn a language, but I learned French, and I studied French, I guess, about 7 or 8 years. And for the first 3 years of it, I was just really, 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 really terrible at it. Unfortunately, eventually I became quite good at it. And after studying about 5 or 6 years, I suddenly discovered it's actually possible not to translate. You kind of have to trust yourself. But once you've got the patterns, it's possible just to start speaking, concentrate on what you want to say rather than concentrating on the grammar. When I came to Taiwan and started studying Chinese, it was kind of a lot easier because I'd already had that experience with French. So I stopped translating much quicker. But one of the very simple things that I did when I was studying Chinese here is that when I was traveling on the trains or the MRT or on a bus, I would often sit and have little conversations with myself in my head. I'd imagine maybe somebody coming up to me in Starbucks and asking me, "Where are you from?" in Chinese, and how I would answer them. I imagine going to job interviews and thinking about how would I answer those questions. And funny enough, I've actually been to job interviews here for English teacher, and they've talked to me in Chinese. It's really useful, that kind of preparation. So that when you have a real situation where you need to speak, you've kind of practiced it before. It kind of becomes automatic. And another very simple thing is actually remembering to breathe. I know it kind of sounds like a stupid thing, but one of the problems is when we're in an exam, we get nervous. And one of the things that happens when we're nervous is our muscles tighten up and get stiff. But speaking is actually using air from your lungs. And that is controlled by the muscles here in what's called the diaphragm. And when you stop doing that, you ended up sounding like this, and you start going red in the face. So one of the very simple things you can train yourself to do is every time you want to speak, you take a big breath. Doing that will also get more oxygen into your blood system, which will also get into your brain and help you to calm down a little bit as well. Okay. Another really important thing is remembering to open your mouth. There's a kind of danger, maybe you worry about your pronunciation. So you think, I can maybe trick the examiner. So you kind of speak like this, and that way they won't hear if your accent's bad. The problem is they can't hear what you're saying. And if they can't hear what you're saying, you get a low score. So it's important to get into the practice of opening your mouth. And it doesn't work if you only do it in the exam, because in the exam, you'll be nervous and you'll forget. So you have to train yourself to do that. Hopefully you can all hear me very clearly. The reason I should be understandable is because I open my mouth a lot. I didn't always do that. Before I was a teacher, I would kind of speak like this all the time. And it's one of the things I had to train myself as a teacher so my students could understand me. But you also need to do this so the examiner can understand you. This one is also important. Your accent is not really that important. In English, we have lots and lots of different accents. You know, some people say banana, some people say banana, glass, heart, hot, and so on and so on. We don't really care, but what we do care about is the rhythm in which we speak, the stress we put on certain sounds. And the easiest way to learn that is by listening to native speakers and then trying to copy them. So don't try to copy the sounds, try to copy the rhythm in which they speak. And if you do that, no matter what your accent, you will start sounding more like a native speaker. So basically what I'm saying is worry about the intonation rather than your accent. The next thing is what I've got called here lexical resources. This is just a fancy way to say vocabulary. One of the things that we're looking for is for your ability to understand different words. You'll see in the listening and reading exam, you will read or hear something and then the answer will be using different vocabulary. So you need to be able to recognize they have the same meaning. But also more importantly, in the speaking and writing exams, you have to say things in using different words. And also you need to avoid repetition. So repeating the same word again and again. It's like the man, like 10 times in 60 seconds. So one of the things we need to do is expand our vocabulary a little bit. Again, one of the important things is just learning to think in English, so that it becomes more automatically. It's perfectly okay to use short, simple words. It's just important not to always use short, simple words. The key to success is basically variety. Okay, so sometimes use long words, sometimes use short words, sometimes use words in between, but mix them up basically. And try to avoid repetition. It's okay to repeat words, but just not again and again and again. Okay. Now, if you want to expand your vocabulary, the simplest way is this, just reading for pleasure. By that, I don't mean studying, I mean reading. all the research shows that when people read a lot, they have better vocabulary. You kind of acquire words. This is how you learnt your Chinese, basically. You heard people talking Chinese and you picked up words from the context, and you didn't study it and you didn't try to memorize it. It just came naturally. Well, this is true also in other languages. When we read for pleasure, from the context we often understand, and because of the emotional connections, they kind of go into our long-term memory more easily. And when I say read for pleasure, it can be anything that is interesting to you. I know some people who have got really good English vocabularies by playing lots of video games in English. I'm not suggesting you should do that, but it is an option. Just basically, if you're really passionate about something and you're exposed to enough English, you will acquire it. You can read books, read magazines about computers or about makeup or whatever it is that you find interesting. Just basically anything and everything. And also, once you learn new vocabulary, make sure that you use it. If you have it here but you never write it or never speak it, when you're in the exam it won't come out. So you need to get it into your everyday language so that it just comes out automatically without you having to think about it. The other thing they'll be looking at is grammar, and this is also kind of very, very similar. Again, it's really important that you think in English. If you are translating, you'll end up with Chinese grammar. And actually, funnily, in some ways, it's even worse when you're writing. When we're speaking, we don't have too much time to think about it. But particularly when people are writing, they spend a lot of time thinking in Chinese and translating it. And the grammar's terrible, unfortunately. So get into that habit of thinking English. Make sure that you know how to say simple sentences. If you can't say a simple sentence correctly, you will not be able to say a long sentence correctly. It's important that you can use tenses. It's not too bad for TOEFL most of the time. There are other exams where they care about tenses much more, but it is still an important thing that you're able to talk about the past and the future and the present, because sometimes the material asks us to do this. We also need to use more complex sentences as well. But the key to this is basically that complex sentences are simple sentences combined together. Complex does not mean long. They're not the same thing. I carry an umbrella. If it rains, I carry an umbrella. Two simple sentences, you join them together, it becomes a complex sentence. Another way to improve your grammar is just reading for pleasure, because that way you'll get to see how native speakers really use language. It says your degree problem will probably have a physical education requirement. Choose one of the following options for your physical education course. State the reasons for choosing that option. So if you remember in question 1, you're going to be asked to make a choice between A or B. And the choice you make is not important. The important things are the reasons why you make that choice and how you explain those reasons. So our choice here is an individual sport such as tennis or golf, or a team sport such as baseball or volleyball. So basically you're being asked, do you prefer individual sports or team sports? The first thing you need to do for each of the questions is to begin with an introduction. Basically, you're being asked to give a kind of mini speech. And for this question, you need to speak for about 40 seconds. And the introduction needs to explain the topic of your talk, which is case, do you prefer A or B? But also you need to show the choice that you've made. So for example, here we might say something like, although some people enjoy individual sports, I prefer team sports because, and you'll see in the question, they talk about, you've got at university, you have to blah, blah, blah. We can kind of ignore that a little bit. We can just simplify what is the real key thing is. It's basically asking, do you prefer this or do you prefer that? Of course, we can do exactly the opposite and say, although some people enjoy team sports, I prefer individual sports because we know that in this question there will always be a choice. So basically what that means, you can more or less plan your introduction before you get into the exam, and you just adapt your introduction to whatever the question is. If you want, you might choose something maybe like this. So we say, in my opinion, A is better than B. So for example, in my opinion, team sports are better than individual sports. And again, we could do exactly the opposite. So I believe that individual sports are better than team sports because, generally speaking, a good answer will have two reasons, but each reason needs to be explained. One of the biggest problems for most students is that answers are too general. So they might say, oh, well, I believe individual sports are better than team sports because they're more fun. What does that mean? So you actually have to explain what that really means. And one of the best ways to do that is give actual examples from your own experience. So for instance, last summer, blah, 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 blah. Use that to explain that. That sometimes you might choose to just give one reason, but if you do that, you're going to need to use two long examples to explain it. You really, really need to give detail to explain these things.